They thought he was just another old man with a faded flag and fading strength. But what happens when a forgotten warrior makes a call that no one ever expected? Let us know in the comments section below. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories just like this one. Frank Delaney didn't move fast these days, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't need to. 72 years old, 3 surgeries, a titanium hip, and a pair of lungs half shot from Agent Orange, and yet he still carried himself like a man who could snap a spine if pushed. Every movement was measured, every silence deliberate. He sat in his creaky wooden chair on the front porch of his modest one-story ranch, eyes focused on the American flag swaying gently from the pole in his yard. It was old, tattered along the edges, sun-bleached and storm-stained, but that was why he kept it flying. It had flown in the mud of Da Nang, stitched into his rucksack by a corpsman after a firefight that left half his platoon in body bags. That flag had grit, like him. Every morning at 600 sharp, Frank rose, stood tall, even if it took him a while, and saluted that flag. No audience, no camera, just respect. He didn't speak much to folks in town unless he had to. Small place, Fairdale. Folks knew who he was. The old Marine out on County Line Road. They knew better than to mess with him. Until recently. The first time Frank noticed the tire tracks on his lawn, he didn't think much of it. Kids, probably. Mischief. Maybe some teenagers out drinking on a dare. But then came the beer cans. Then the broken mailbox. Then the vulgar graffiti painted on the side of his old barn. Old blood bag in red spray paint, bold as war paint. Frank didn't call the sheriff, not because he didn't trust him. Sheriff Cole was a decent enough man. But Frank had spent enough time in command to know the difference between fear and respect. Law enforcement couldn't teach these kids either. Then the rumors reached him. A biker gang, the Hellhounds, not local boys, drifters, violent, brash, and eager to plant their flag. They'd set up just north of town, squatting in an old machine shop that had been shuttered for years, selling meth, running intimidation rackets, shaking down gas stations. Sheriff Cole's hands were tied. They weren't breaking enough laws to go in strong, but they were breaking just enough to keep everyone scared. Frank wasn't scared. He was disappointed. Ray Haskins had told him about the gang over a coffee one morning at the VFW hall. Ray still had that grizzled spark behind his eyes, still wore his dog tags like they were armor. "They don't know who they're messing with," Ray had muttered, voice low, eyes hard. "We cleared villages with less warning." Frank had nodded but said nothing. Not yet. 2 nights later, it happened. Frank had just poured himself a finger of whiskey and settled back in his chair when he heard the engines, low, growling, arrogant, not just 1, 5, or 6 at least. The kind of roar that makes stray dogs run and kids hide under beds. The bikes didn't pass his house. They stopped right in front of it. Frank stood up slow, placing the glass on the railing. He didn't go inside, didn't grab his cane or his gun. He just watched. The gang dismounted like they owned the earth beneath their boots. Leather cuts with stitched skulls, flames licking the letters Hellhounds MC. Tattoos covered faces, hands, necks. One of them pulled out a phone and started filming. The tallest among them, big, lean, maybe late 30s, with a jaw like a hatchet and eyes like ice water, walked up to Frank's flagpole. He didn't say a word. He struck a match. Frank's voice rang out firm, gravelly, and unshaken. "You don't want to do that." The tall one, Troy Blaze Mercer, Frank would later learn, turned to face him, grinning like a dog that caught the scent of fear. "It's a rag, old man. You fly it like it still means something." Frank didn't flinch. "It means everything." Troy tilted his head. "What are you going to do? Salute it to death?" Laughter erupted from the others. A couple of them clapped. Then Troy held the flame to the bottom corner of the flag. Frank's body tensed, but not with rage. Not yet. He didn't yell. He didn't run. He stood taller. The fire caught slow at first, then fast. The fabric curled, black as smoke, wafted toward the stars. Frank watched every inch burn, not because he wanted to, because he needed to remember it. He said only one thing before turning his back to them. "You shouldn't have done that." Troy spit in the dirt. "Next time it'll be your porch." They revved their engines and tore off, kicking dust onto Frank's boots as they left. The laughter echoed into the distance. Frank didn't speak again until he stepped inside and picked up the old rotary phone on his kitchen wall. He didn't dial 911. He punched in a 7-digit number burned into his memory from decades past. 1 ring, 2, then a voice on the other end, gruff, cautious. "Yeah, that's Frank." Silence. Then, "No shit. They burned my flag." Another pause. Longer. "You want the boys?" Frank didn't answer with words. He didn't need to. "All right," the voice said, steel in every syllable. "Give us 24 hours. Frank hung up and stared out the kitchen window. The flagpole stood bare, scorched at the tip, but in his mind he could already hear boots on gravel, brothers returning home. He didn't drink that whiskey. He poured it down the sink and went to bed with his boots by the door. Frank was up before the sun, dressed in full, not for show, he never did anything for show, but in respect. His old utility uniform, pressed the night before, sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal the faded USMC tattoo on his forearm, his boots polished black and scuffed with stories. The faint scent of Brasso lingered on his belt buckle, the kind of readiness that didn't ask for a parade, it demanded presence. He stood at attention in front of the empty flagpole, eyes locked forward, the rising light just beginning to paint gold along the tops of the hills. The grass beneath him was still scorched from the night before. Ashes clung to the pole like it still remembered the heat. Frank didn't look at the damage. His focus was on the sky. He saluted the morning, not because the flag was gone, but because the meaning wasn't. Behind him, the creak of tires came up slow. A dusty pickup pulled into the gravel drive, engine humming low. The door opened, and out stepped Raymond Haskins. Sturdy as ever, denim jacket stretched across his broad shoulders, salt and pepper beard trimmed down to an edge. In his hands, a folded American flag, crisp and reverent. Frank turned and gave a single nod. Ray stepped forward. "Didn't have to say a word, brother. I saw the video." Frank raised a brow. "It's out already?" Ray grunted. "Kids these days." One of those bikers was live streaming, TikTok or some other nonsense. By the time I got home last night, my nephew had already texted me. Didn't they know who that was? Frank looked down, then back at the pole. "Guess they didn't." Ray's voice softened as he unfolded the flag. "Then we'll remind them." They raised the new flag in silence, both men moving in sync like they had decades earlier. The wind caught it halfway up, unfurling the red, white, and blue with defiant grace. When it reached the top, Frank secured the line with a sharp pull. Then they both stepped back, shoulders squared, and saluted together. A beat of silence passed. Then another. The roar of another engine broke the morning air. A Jeep this time, military green, practically a relic, tires big enough to climb trees. Behind the wheel was Clyde Turner, Vietnam-era Army motor pool turned full-time rancher, his hat tipped low and an unlit cigar clamped in the corner of his mouth. He rolled the window down as he pulled up. "Heard the call," he said simply. "I brought the tools." Frank nodded, a flicker of something behind his eyes. Not gratitude, something older, something deeper. A bond forged in the kind of fire no civilian could ever understand. Ray turned to him. "I called Doc Harris, too, said he'd bring supplies just in case, and Mike's on his way down from Dallas. Told him we'd need eyes, ears, and encryption." Frank gave a slow nod. "They all come." Ray raised an eyebrow. "You sure about this? We're not 25 anymore. You stir this pot, it's going to boil over." Frank met his gaze with steel. "I didn't stir anything. They did. I'm just making sure the lid doesn't blow off in the wrong direction." Clyde chuckled from the Jeep. "Same Delaney, still got that tactful way of saying, "Let's raise hell." They shared the kind of laugh that came not from humor, but from recognition, from knowing you weren't alone in the trench, even if the war was different now. Over the next few hours, more vehicles came down that road than had in months. Not flashy ones, not loud ones, just old pickups, faded SUVs, and a single battered Harley with the Marine Corps emblem on its gas tank. One by one, they arrived. Former Rangers, SEALs, medics, tankers, snipers, comms techs, and mechanics. No one came empty-handed. They brought MREs and coffee, rifles locked in cases, radios rigged with backup power, and gear bags full of what they might need, just in case. But what they really brought was presence. That steady, grounded kind that said, "You are not alone." The barn became a command post. Clyde got to work first, sweeping out the graffiti, hanging tarps, converting one corner into a supply station. He set up cots with practiced precision, pulled out a table and started sketching a perimeter map in chalk on a wood plank. Mike Jennings arrived last, stepping out of a black van with a rolling case in one hand and a half-empty Red Bull in the other. Former Navy SEAL-turned-private cybersecurity contractor, Mike looked like he hadn't slept in a week and didn't care. He greeted Frank with a fist bump and zero ceremony. "I've already tapped into their burners," he said, sliding open his laptop as he walked. "Tracked 2 of their phones bouncing off a cell tower near Old Mill Road. Another's been piggybacking on Wi-Fi from a pawn shop 3 towns over. Sloppy." Frank leaned in. "And the leader?" Mike cracked his neck. "Troy Mercer, known alias Blaze, discharged for conduct unbecoming, bounced around 3 MCs, built his own crew out of dropouts, runaways, and bottom feeders. 2 felonies, nothing that stuck. But he likes attention. YouTube channel under a fake name. He's trying to build a brand." Frank's jaw tensed. "He's about to destroy one instead." Mike looked up from his screen. "You want this quiet or public?" Frank thought for a long moment. "Both." The sun was overhead now. The barn hummed with quiet activity, cords being run, radios tested, gear laid out on tarps like sacred tools. A few of the younger veterans practiced formations outside, just in case it got physical. Not because they wanted a fight, because they were trained not to lose one. Inside, Ray unwrapped an old photograph, yellowed at the edges. 4 men in uniform, dirt-streaked and grinning. One of them, barely older than a boy, was Frank. Younger, eyes sharp, the weight of survival still fresh. Ray passed it to him. "I figured you'd want this up." Frank stared at it. "We buried 2 of them 6 months later. 3rd one took his own life after coming home." Ray lowered his voice. "You didn't." "No," Frank said, voice quiet. "But it's only because they kept me from falling first." Ray placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then let's keep standing, for them, for all of us." At that moment a low rumble echoed in the distance. Bikes. 6, maybe 7 engines. Everyone paused. Frank stepped out onto the porch, squinting into the horizon. Ray followed. Too early for retaliation. Frank shook his head. "We can't." The gang didn't stop this time. They just drove past, slow, loud, tires hissing as they slid through gravel. One of them, new face, young, flipped the bird as they passed. Another tossed a crushed soda can into Frank's yard. But they saw it now. The men on the porch. The flag flying proud again. The cars lined up the drive. They saw the change, and as they rode away, none of them laughed. Frank turned to Ray. "They're measuring us." Ray cracked his knuckles. "Then let's give them a good look." Frank didn't smile, but something in his eyes burned steady. "They burned one flag," he said. "We're about to raise something bigger." The hellhounds didn't come back the next day, or the day after. That was the part Frank didn't like. Silence could be louder than gunfire. He knew that from Hugh and Case on. When it got too quiet, that meant someone was planning something. Bikers didn't just ride away from a challenge, especially not punks like Troy Mercer, who wanted nothing more than to prove himself king of a place that didn't ask for a crown. Frank kept the same routine each morning, raised the flag at dawn, coffee black, porch chair, quiet vigilance. Except now he wasn't alone. Ray took the north perimeter, Clyde and Mike rotated watch on the barn. Even Doc Harris showed up every evening with a cooler full of sandwiches and a sidearm tucked beneath his lab coat. The old barn had transformed. What was once cobwebs and silence was now a living heartbeat of preparation. Radios clicked with updates, whiteboards filled with hand-drawn maps and rough schedules. Frank didn't need a war room, he needed a home defended. There was a difference, but not by much. Mike had hacked into a trail cam one of the gang members had stupidly synced to his personal cloud account. They weren't just hanging back. They were watching. Observing movement on County Line Road, tracking who came and went from Frank's property, noting patterns. Frank stared at the fuzzy black and white footage. Two bikers crouched behind brush, their vests just visible in the lens's edge, binoculars in hand. They were cocky enough not to mask their colors. Hellhounds. They wanted him to know they were watching. Psychological pressure. Disrupt routine, break the mind before the body. He'd taught that tactic himself once. Now they were using it on him. That night, Frank didn't sleep. He sat in his living room, shotgun across his lap, eyes half closed but ears wide open. Not paranoia. Precision. At 2:17 IMN, tires whispered against gravel. Not a roar, a crawl. Frank moved without sound, sliding the curtain just enough to peek through. Two bikes. Lights off. He was already outside before they made it halfway up the drive. The night was thick, moonlight broken by tree shadows. Frank stayed hidden until he heard the first footstep on his porch. Then the motion light snapped on. He stepped out from the side of the house, shotgun raised, not at head level, but enough to say, "Try me." The two bikers froze. One was barely 20, scruffy, wiry, a patchy beard that didn't match the bravado in his eyes. The other was older, maybe 35, with a scar that curved from ear to jaw like a sickle. "Well," Frank said, voice low, even, "looks like y'all picked the wrong time for a house call." Scarface took a step back, hand inching toward his vest. Frank clicked the safety off. "I wouldn't," he warned. Behind him a second light came on, then a third. Ray stepped out from the barn, rifle cradled in his arms. Clyde emerged from the shadows near the truck, a heavy pipe wrench slung over his shoulder like a medieval war hammer. "You boys lost," Ray called out. Patchy Beard lifted his hands. "We weren't gonna do nothin'." "No?" Clyde asked. "Just out for a midnight stroll on private property dressed like extras from a Mad Max reboot?" "Blaze sent us to talk," Scarface said, steadying himself. "Said maybe things got a little too heated." Frank didn't lower the shotgun. "Blaze burned my flag," he said. "There's no walking that back." Scarface smirked. "Yeah, but that flag's back up now, ain't it? So maybe we all just cool down and forget the whole thing." "You forget things when they don't matter," Frank said. "That one mattered." Ray stepped forward. "You want to pass a message. Here's one. Your leader's not the first fire starter we've dealt with, and he won't be the last." Clyde added, "You tell him if he steps foot on this property again he won't be leaving with his teeth." The younger biker shifted on his heels. "Man, you don't get it. Blaze ain't looking for peace. He's looking to make a point." Frank's voice dropped to a near whisper. "So am I." The bikers backed off, hands raised. They mounted their bikes and tore off down the road, this time not bothering to be quiet. Not this time. This time, they wanted to be heard. After the dust settled, Frank turned to Ray. "That was just their recon squad." Ray nodded grimly. "Testing the lines." "They'll be back," Frank said. "Louder. Meaner." Clyde looked between them. "Then what's the plan?" Frank stared at the flagpole. "We don't wait. We make the first move." The next morning, Mike set up an operation from the barn. laptops, encrypted comms, even a drone outfitted with a thermal cam. From a mile above, they watched the Hellhounds compound, the abandoned machine shop, buzzing with activity, bikes being prepped, oil drums loaded into the back of pickups, a new batch of members, 10 or so, most of them fresh recruits probably drawn in by Blaze's growing social media antics. Frank studied the footage. "They're not planning a warning," he said. "They're planning a statement." Mike pulled up another feed. "They've got a date. Blaze tagged his location in a live stream last night. Accident or ego, hard to say. Either way, he said he's taking back Fairdale this Friday." That was 3 days away. Ray rubbed his beard. "We can't just ambush them. We're not law enforcement." Frank didn't blink. "We're citizens defending our home." "Lines get blurry quick," Ray warned. Frank looked at him. "Then let's make the lines sharper." They didn't go to the sheriff. Not yet. Sheriff Cole had already done what he could, and that line had been drawn in pencil. Frank was writing his in stone. They focused on preparation. Ray and Clyde set up road spikes at 2 points near the South Pass, the only access route from the gang's compound to County Line Road. Mike coordinated digital surveillance, rigging cell tower spoofers to cut off their communication when the time came. Doc prepped a med tent in case things got messy. Frank walked the perimeter of his land every hour, every inch, memorizing angles, shadows, cover points. He was back in it, not reliving the past, rewriting it. 2 nights later, the Hellhounds made their first real move. They didn't come for Frank. They went after Emily Roark. She was the local reporter who'd filmed Frank's new flag raising and uploaded it to her blog. Small-time coverage, but it had gone semi-viral in veteran circles. Emily called Frank directly, voice shaking. "They followed me home," she whispered. 3 of them, parked across the street. "They didn't say anything, but they stared for an hour. I don't think they're done." Frank responded with the calm of someone who had stared down worse and lived to tell about it. "Lock your doors," he told her. "We're already on our way." He didn't call the police. He didn't have to. Within minutes, Ray, Clyde, and Mike were loaded up and moving. Frank rode with them, the old Chevy rattling like a war drum. When they reached Emily's house, the bikes were gone. But a message had been left. Spray paint across her garage door. "Next time we knock." Frank stared at the words, jaw clenched. Ray's voice broke the silence. "This ain't about territory anymore. It's personal." Frank nodded once, slow. "Good," he said. "So is our response." The day before Blaze's promised takeover of Fairdale, the sky above County Line Road was heavy and still, like the air was holding its breath. Inside the barn, the old wood creaked under tension, not from the weather, but from the weight of preparation. A war was coming, not in the trenches or jungles this time, but in a Texas pasture guarded by men who'd already fought one too many. Frank stood over the makeshift war table, fingers pressed into a county map. He traced the roads like they were veins in his hand, memorizing each artery and every corner where something could go wrong. "We can't match their numbers," Mike said, scanning a monitor nearby. "But we don't need to." Frank's eyes didn't leave the map. "We just need to hold the ground they want." "They're expecting fear," Ray added from the side, loading magazines with calm, mechanical precision. "They're not expecting formation." Doc Harris set down a crate of medical supplies. "You know what this reminds me of?" Clyde raised a brow. "Please don't say the good old days." "No," Doc said, chuckling. "Just reminds me of all those times we were told not to get involved. Let someone else handle it. And look how that worked out." Frank looked up. "We're not just standing for my flag. We're standing for the idea that we don't back down when home gets threatened." A long silence followed, the kind that didn't need to be filled with words. It was the silence before a storm. The shared breath of brothers who had no illusions about what the next day could bring. Mike spoke up again, tapping on his laptop. "Drones caught some movement an hour ago. Hellhounds are assembling. I count 13 bikes, 4 trucks. They're loading up." Frank nodded. "Timing?" "They'll hit at first light," Mike said, "right when the town wakes up." Ray crossed his arms. "So they want witnesses. Fear's the currency." "We'll bankrupt them," Frank replied. They divided roles with the efficiency of a trained unit. Frank would lead the southern perimeter. Ray and Clyde would handle the eastern flank, where the tree line met the creek. Mike set up a remote interference signal. Any phone within a half-mile radius of the Delaney property would lose its connection when activated. No calls, no uploads, no reinforcements. They weren't planning for violence, but they weren't pretending anymore. This was no longer a game of warnings. This was a defense operation. That night they shared a meal. Grilled venison from Clyde's freezer, boiled potatoes, and beer colder than the looks they'd be giving the enemy tomorrow. No speeches, just nods, and that familiar way military men talk with their eyes instead of their mouths. Before midnight they turned in. One by one, lights in the barn dimmed. Outside, the flag Frank had raised the day after the burning still waved, this one even older, stitched from two different torn ones, faded into a red so deep it almost looked black. He didn't take it down. Not tonight. Frank stayed up, sitting on his porch, shotgun at his side. He watched the road, the tree line, and the shadows in between. At some point, Ray joined him, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. "You know," Ray said, settling into the chair beside him, "we could have walked away. Told the sheriff, let it be someone else's problem." Frank took the mug, sipped, then nodded. "Yeah? And we could have walked away from Da Nang, too. But we didn't." Ray looked down at the steam rising from his cup. "Blaze thinks this is about dominance, showing who runs the town." Frank's jaw tightened. "He'll find out real quick. Veterans don't need to run a town to protect it." They sat in silence again until the first flicker of orange peeled across the eastern horizon. Then the engines started. It began as a distant hum, but it grew fast, faster than they'd expected. Within minutes, the sound of motorcycles tore through the still morning like thunder. Lights flared from down the road, high beams slicing through the mist like sabers. Mike's voice came over the radio, clipped to Frank's chest. "They're coming in hot. 14 bikes, 2 trucks in the back, confirming Blaze in lead position." Frank clicked once. No panic, no alarm, just readiness. Ray stood, stretching his arms. "Time to say good morning." The first wave of bikes hit the road leading up to the property, tires eating gravel like fire eats kindling. They came fast, loud, and cocky, until they hit the first surprise. Clyde's tire spikes, handmade from scrap metal and rage, ripped through 3 front tires. Bikes skidded sideways, riders thrown like rag dolls into the ditch. The convoy halted, confusion ripping through them. From the barn rooftop, Mike activated the jamming device. Phones died, signals dropped. The gang was suddenly blind to the outside world. Frank stepped into view from the side of the house, shotgun slung but not raised, calm, unflinching. Blaze cut his engine and dismounted. His vest flapped as he walked forward, lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was tall, lean, and greasy with swagger. "Well, look at you," he called out. "Grandpa's got himself a little militia." Frank said nothing. Blaze kept walking. "We just came to talk. Offer you one last chance to bow out before things get real messy." Ray stepped up next to Frank. "You already made it messy when you burned that flag." Blaze's grin grew wider. "It was a piece of cloth, man. You act like we burned down a church." Frank's voice was calm, but it hit like steel. "That flag draped over coffins of men better than you. It's not just cloth, it's memory, it's sacrifice." Blaze paused. For just a second, something flickered behind his eyes. Maybe doubt, maybe fear, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "You got 30 seconds to stand down," Frank said, now stepping off the porch. "After that you'll leave on your feet, or you'll crawl." Blaze snapped his fingers. 2 of his men surged forward. One carried a bat, the other a chain. Clyde, already waiting behind the tree line, stepped out with a pump-action shotgun and fired a single blast into the air. The gang froze. From the opposite direction, Doc appeared, pistol drawn but lowered. More veterans emerged from the brush, not in uniform, not in body armor, but with the presence of men who'd faced worse and lived. Outnumbered, surrounded, the hellhound's bravado cracked. One of them, a young man, maybe 19, dropped his bat and backed up. Blaze looked around. No signal, no reinforcements, just his crew, faltering. "You make your stand now," Frank said, stepping closer, "or you turn around and disappear." Blaze stared at him, his jaw twitched. Then finally he spat at the ground and turned back to his bike. "We'll be back," he muttered. Frank didn't blink. "You won't." The hellhounds retreated. Engines faded. Silence returned. Frank stood still, breathing steady, watching until the last speck of dust settled. The barn light flickered back on. Mike appeared at the door, nodding once. Ray clapped Frank on the back. "No shots fired. That's a win." Frank nodded slowly. "It's a beginning." 2 days passed. Peace held, but it wasn't the kind anyone trusted. Frank knew better than to believe it was over. Men like Blaze didn't lick their wounds and retreat quietly. They regrouped. They came back harder, dirtier, meaner. That's what made them dangerous, not their strength, but their pride. At the VFW, talk had already started circulating. Townspeople had heard something went down out on County Line. Rumors spun like wind through wheat. Some said Frank had a sniper in his barn. Others claimed the hellhounds had been arrested. The truth sat somewhere between legend and silence. Frank didn't correct anyone, let them believe what they needed to. He had other things on his mind. Every night he ran the same check: perimeter, radio batteries, backdoor locks, gear status. Not because he expected another attack, but because he expected something worse: complacency. And on the third night, his gut finally stopped whispering and started shouting. Blaze hadn't left town, he'd just changed the game. Mike was the first to see the shift. His drone feed picked up 2 unfamiliar trucks, unmarked, no plates, parked near the county fairgrounds. Nobody inside, no bikes in sight, but gear in the back. Heavy gear, maybe weapons, maybe something else. Blaze had switched tactics, hiding in the open, ditching colors, keeping low. Ray caught a separate thread. A local hardware store owner mentioned offhandedly that some rough-looking guys had bought 20 gallons of diesel, cash only, no questions asked. That same morning, the side wall of the Fairdale Community Center had been tagged with a different symbol. Not the usual hellhound's emblem, but a crude red fang painted across a circle, a mark, a warning. Or maybe a countdown. Frank stared at it for a long time before saying anything. "They're building toward something," he said finally, hands on his hips, "and they want it big." Clyde leaned against the truck. Public spectacle. Something that sends a message to anyone who stood up to them. Ray folded his arms. "Like you?" Frank didn't blink. Mike checked his tablet. "They've got new burner phones. Scrambling GPS, but I'm getting signals bouncing near the train depot and out by the grain silos." Doc rubbed the back of his neck. "This ain't a gang anymore. It's a militia." Frank turned to the group. "Then we treat them like one." By nightfall, the veterans had split up into coordinated teams. Clyde and Ray took the southern trails with thermal goggles and silent radios. Doc stayed in town, posted up at the VFW under the guise of poker night, watching foot traffic and waiting to see if any of Blaze's crew came sniffing around. Mike stayed in the barn, drone surveillance on loop, power banks charged, ears locked in on every frequency the hellhounds might be piggybacking. Frank stayed on the porch. He didn't pace, he didn't fidget, he watched, like a hawk, like a statue, still focused, listening to the wind for anything that didn't belong. It came just after 2:30 a.m. The radio crackled with static, then Ray's voice, clipped and sharp. "Movement, east side. 4 individuals, no bikes." Frank clicked once, then double-tapped. That meant visual confirmation requested. Mike's voice followed. Got him on thermal, small arms, one carrying what looks like a jerry can. Frank was already up, already lacing boots, already moving toward the truck. By the time he pulled onto the road, Ray's voice came again. They're heading toward Emily's house. Frank's grip tightened on the wheel. The hellhounds weren't coming for him this time. They were coming for those who stood by him. He called Emily mid-turn. She picked up on the second ring, voice groggy. Get up, Frank barked. Lights off, lock the doors, go to the basement, now. She didn't ask questions. That was the part he appreciated most about her. She just said, Got it, and the line went dead. Frank arrived in under 5 minutes. Ray and Clyde were already there, crouched low behind the hedgerow across from Emily's porch. The house was dark, no movement inside, no sound. But the scent of gasoline was thick in the air. One of the hellhounds stood on the lawn, holding the can above his head, sloshing liquid in a wide arc toward the front steps. Another knelt by the garage, stuffing something, maybe paper, maybe worse, into a glass bottle. The third kept lookout near the road. The fourth was already on the back porch. Frank stepped out from the shadows like the past itself. Drop it. All four froze. The one by the steps turned, eyes wide, mouth open. The can fell from his hand with a dull, plastic thud. I said, drop it, Frank repeated, shotgun lowered but ready. His voice didn't raise. It didn't need to. The one at the garage took off running. Clyde moved fast, faster than a man his age should, and tackled him clean across the driveway. Gravel scattered, a grunt, then silence. Ray moved in on the one near the road. The kid didn't even try to fight. He dropped to his knees with hands up. Frank advanced toward the porch, eyes fixed on the last one. The man didn't budge. His face was partially covered, but his stance was familiar. Then he took off the mask. It was Blaze. I was wondering when you'd show up, Frank said. Blaze grinned, but it was brittle now. He looked tired, unshaven, like the weight of leading was finally sinking in. You think you've won, Blaze said. You think you're heroes. No, Frank said. We're defenders. Blaze's hand moved subtly to his belt. Frank's eyes tracked it. Don't, he warned. But Blaze moved anyway, quick, yanking a blade from his belt and lunging forward with a guttural yell. Frank didn't flinch. He stepped to the side, grabbing Blaze's wrist with practiced strength, twisting it until the knife dropped. The man yelped and swung wild, but Frank ducked, landed a hard elbow to his gut, and kicked his legs out from under him. Blaze hit the deck. Frank stood over him, breathing steady, shotgun now aimed square at Blaze's chest. You're done, he said. This town doesn't belong to you. It never did. Police sirens wailed in the distance. Sheriff Cole had been on standby, Mike's fail-safe trigger, a single encrypted ping that signaled it was time to bring the law. Blaze spat blood and cursed. This isn't over. Frank lowered the shotgun slightly. It is for you. The sheriff arrived minutes later with 2 deputies, guns drawn. Blaze and his men were cuffed without a fight. There was no room left for posturing, no audience left to impress. Emily emerged from her basement just as Blaze was loaded into the back of the squad car. She stood beside Frank, silent, watching as the gang was taken away. You okay? Frank asked. She nodded. Thanks to you. No, Frank said, glancing at Ray and Clyde behind him. Thanks to them. I just lit the beacon. They answered it. Emily watched the taillights fade. What happens now? Frank exhaled. Now, we remind this town that standing up isn't reckless, it's necessary. Sunlight touched the tops of the old pine trees surrounding Frank's land, pouring down in long golden ribbons. The storm was over. A week had passed since the sheriff hauled Blaze and his remaining crew out of Fairdale in handcuffs. 4 of them were already facing federal charges: illegal weapons, arson attempts, drug trafficking. Blaze himself, he was looking at a minimum of 15 years. The feds didn't mess around when you crossed state lines with intent to incite violence. especially not with a criminal record like his. No one in town doubted that the veterans had saved Fairdale, but the beauty was, they didn't ask for the credit. Not once. Frank returned to routine the next morning as if nothing had changed. Raised the flag, coffee on the porch, checked the fence line, fed the hound he'd adopted from the shelter last year. The only difference now was how the town looked at him. Where once there had been distance, there was now warmth. Where there had been wariness, now there was reverence. It started with the grocery store clerk who refused to let him pay for his milk and bread. Then the high school principal stopped by with a group of students who wanted to interview him for a Veterans Day project. The diner on Main renamed their Saturday breakfast special the Delaney Stack. 3 pancakes, 2 eggs, and a strip of bacon for every branch of service. Frank grumbled about the fuss, but when no one was looking, a soft smile would tug at the edge of his weathered face. But the biggest change happened 3 days later. Emily showed up in her dusty silver hatchback, hair tied back, notepad in hand, camera slung across her shoulder. She stepped onto Frank's porch like she belonged there. "They're holding a ceremony," she said, "out at Veterans Park." Frank looked up from his coffee. "What for?" Frank shook his head. "Don't want that." Emily crossed her arms. "It's not just for you. It's for all of you. Ray, Clyde, Doc, Mike. The town wants to say thank you. They're calling it Flag Day, whether you like it or not." He took a long sip. "You think people are just going to forget what happened?" "No," she said softly. "That's why we need to remember it the right way." Frank looked out at the flagpole. The stars and stripes flapped strong and proud in the spring wind. Not a crease in sight. "All right," he said finally, "but I'm not making any speeches." Emily smiled. "We'll see." Saturday came with clear skies and warmth on the breeze. People gathered early, young, old, families with kids, local business owners, even the sheriff's entire department. Folding chairs dotted the grass. A podium stood in front of the stone memorial etched with names of soldiers from every war Fairdale had ever seen its sons and daughters leave for. Frank didn't sit. He stood off to the side in his pressed uniform, flanked by Ray, Clyde, Mike, and Doc. None of them had worn dress blues in years, but today they looked like they'd never taken them off. The mayor spoke first, brief but heartfelt. Then Emily stepped to the podium, eyes scanning the crowd. "This town could have lost a lot more than peace," she said. "But we didn't, because a group of men stood up, not for glory, not for attention, but because it was right." She paused, eyes landing on Frank. "Some of you saw the video of what happened. Some of you heard the rumors. But I want to tell you what I saw with my own eyes. I saw men stand against intimidation. I saw leadership without ego. And I saw a flag rise again, not just on a pole, but in our hearts." There was quiet, no applause yet, just the heavy, respectful silence of people absorbing something true. Then Emily stepped aside. The mayor returned to the mic, cleared his throat, and motioned toward Frank. "Sergeant Frank Delaney," he said, "on behalf of the town of Fairdale, we'd like to honor your service, not just overseas but here, at home." He turned to a soldier in active uniform standing nearby, who stepped forward with a neatly folded flag in his arms. It was pristine, new, not a wrinkle or smudge. But Frank shook his head. "I've already got one," he said. The mayor blinked. "Sergeant?" Frank turned, gesturing to the flagpole behind them. There, fluttering in the breeze, was the same stitched-together flag from earlier, the one made of 2 old, weather-worn flags, sewn with care and history. "I raised that one after they tried to burn it," Frank said, loud enough for all to hear, "not because it's perfect, but because it's endured." There was a beat of silence, then a slow clap, then another, and within seconds the entire crowd was on their feet, applauding, not loud, not raucous, just steady. "Honest?" Ray leaned over to him, muttering, "Told you it'd be a thing." Frank grunted. "You tell anyone I teared up, and I'll deny it under oath." "I'll take it to the grave," Ray said, laughing. After the ceremony, people lingered. Kids ran up to ask questions, parents shook hands, veterans from different wars embraced, shared stories, swapped numbers. Doc handed out water bottles from a cooler in his truck like it was basic training all over again. Clyde managed to convince the sheriff to pose for a photo with Frank next to the flagpole. Mike, ever the ghost, had already disappeared. But Frank spotted the drone hovering quietly above the crowd. He smiled. Back at the house later that evening, the sun dipped low behind the hills, painting everything in that perfect golden hour light. Frank sat on his porch. Same chair, same mug. But something was different. He wasn't alone. Ray was in the rocker beside him. Clyde leaned against the railing, tossing peanuts into his mouth. Doc sat on the steps, petting Frank's old hound. And Emily, she sat cross-legged on the edge of the porch, scribbling notes, camera at her feet. They didn't talk much. Didn't need to. The flag waved gently above them. Frank looked up at it and gave a small, crisp salute. He wasn't saluting the fabric. He was saluting everything it stood for. The friends he'd lost, the town he'd saved, the brotherhood that never left. For the first time in a long while, he felt it in his bones. Not just peace, but belonging. Not forgotten, not alone, and that was more than enough.